Well, it's very nice to be here and talking to you today, and I hope that my presentation will expand your horizons a little, because I'm talking about this project, Maritime Spatial Planning and Land-Sea Interactions, and it's one of the beginning of ESPON stepping into the sea. And I think it's important to recognise that Europe doesn't just involve the land. For some countries, and the UK is an example, the majority of their territorial area is sea. So in the UK's case, 80% of our territorial area is sea. And so I think that this is something that will develop over the years as an increasing feature of ESPON activity. So what I want to explain today is something about the context for the study. I want to share with you some of our approaches that we are developing to begin to understand land-sea interactions, and then to end with the beginnings of our findings and some of the early findings in relation to how do we actually think about land-sea interactions in practice. So some of you, including some in the room who are involved in it, may have picked up on the ESTADOR project. This is the European Seas Territorial Development Opportunities and Risks. And this was a project that was the first major attempt by ESPON to begin to think about the sea and its relationship with the land. And one of the major challenges in that project is how do we integrate sea-based data and land-based data in a consistent way, which is such a feature of ESPON. But our project now is not ESTADOR 2, so it has quite a different emphasis. And the starting point for our work is the Msp Directive, which some of you may be aware of, which was introduced in 2014. And not only does this require member states with a coastline to establish marine spatial plans by 2021, but it also has a specific requirement for marine spatial planning, or for authorities in general, to consider land-sea interactions with the aim, in line with the integrated maritime policy of the EU, to develop integrated visions across the land-sea divide. So this is the base for our work. Now, the objectives, the overall aim is to try and think about how do we produce a comparable and consistent way of thinking about land-sea interactions across European space. So we start by defining what land-sea interactions are and how we might operationalize consideration of those. Our particular focus is the impacts of, on land of maritime activities. So this project is much more land-focused than perhaps the ESTADOR project was. Looking at existing practices for managing land-sea interactions, and ultimately the aim is to come up with guidelines on good management of LSI in territorial planning. So I think it's important to sort of outline to you and maybe encourage you to also expand your sort of visions of territorial planning, is that territorial planning includes both terrestrial planning but also marine spatial planning. And in the intersection of those, what we're trying to seek to do is identify critical issues related to land-sea interaction. And what we're trying to develop are guidelines that relate to a sort of comparable method of considering these, but in a place-sensitive way. So the core of our approach is to develop a method which includes particular emphasis on understanding maritime activities and their relationship to the land, look at management practices, to experiment with data and mapping. And all that work is centred around 5 case study areas, and we'll produce guidelines. So the case studies range in scale. So from areas like Gdansk Bay and the Slovenian coastline, which is actually very short, right the way up to a case study that was looking at the Netherlands as a whole. And what we are experimenting with is how do you actually drill down into the complexity of land-sea interactions. And we're doing that by looking at particular focal sectors in each of the case studies. So how do we begin to think about land-sea interactions? And land-sea interactions include socio-economic activities, there are environmental dimensions to them, but there's also important governance arrangements. And amongst all that, we are trying to identify some key issues that perhaps are a starting point for this type of analysis. So governance includes both marine planning as it's emerging, but also terrestrial planning. How far to date does it really address these issues? In terms of the socio-economic activities, we are, this work is being led by Ecoris, who have developed for the European Commission many reports on blue growth, and we're using their value chain analysis that they have developed, which is looking at key sectors, their backward linkages, their forward linkages, and trying to develop a spatialization of that value chain. We're not particularly going into ecological connections, but I think it's suffice to say we can't avoid this, because the more I have got to understand about this, the more I realise that many, if not most, of the ecological damage that is being caused to the sea actually comes from the land in all sorts of different ways. So, just to share with you some of our sort of conclusions or some emerging findings, what we are trying to produce are some maps to show the spatial extent of these value chains associated with critical sectors such as maritime transport. And I think the key point we're making here is that this isn't a subject that is just focused on the coastal zone. It is something that connects all of Europe. 80% of everything we touch and eat comes by sea. So the sea is very significant. So these are just some very early examples of the maps. Our focus is very much on connecting to spatial planning, both land and sea. And I think one of the things that comes out of that, so we're asked to think about, well, what can spatial planning do? And what we're identifying is that obviously it's part of a wider policy framework that relates to land-sea interactions. It has, both of those activities have important spatial management activities associated with them. But I think what is emerging quite strongly is they have a major role to play in good governance of land-sea interactions. They are the focal point for discussions about complex issues that extend well beyond spatial planning in terms of how you might influence them. But they perhaps are a critical place where those discussions can take place. So the guidelines we are trying to make as user-friendly as possible. This is some ideas about what they might look like. And I think the key point that comes out from many of the presentations today is that the case studies, we hope, will provide little narratives about particular forms of land-sea interaction in particular places at different scales. And it will be those narratives that will perhaps encourage others to engage with this subject. So in terms of next steps, we've gone on a very fast time frame, as many of the other projects. We've got our final report in May. And I think the key next step for us are a series of workshops in each of the case study areas that will mainly take place in January and February. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.